Random House Audio presents The Age of Gold, The California Gold Rush and the New American Dream by H.W. Brands. Read for you by Brian Mancinelli. In the wilderness, a man made do. Given any choice in the matter, James Marshall wouldn't have retained Jenny Wimmer as cook and housekeeper for his construction gang. She was stubborn, surly, belligerently unimaginative in the kitchen, and fully aware she couldn't be replaced. She cooked what she wanted, when she wanted. Meals were served at Jenny's whim. Yet she grew furious if the men weren't seated and ready when she deigned to deliver the food. The men chafed under her arbitrary rule during the late autumn of 1847, and their annoyance reached rebellion on Christmas Day. Most of the men were Mormons, devout Christians, after their latter-day fashion, and they desired to savor their holiday and honor their Lord's birth by grooming themselves more fastidiously than the normal work schedule allowed. As insurrections went, it wasn't much. The Mormons simply insisted they must be allowed to build their own living quarters, where they would cook their own meals. Marshall was reluctant to grant the demand. For every hour devoted to building the new cabin would be an hour stolen from building the sawmill, which was the reason they were all wintering at this remote site, 40 miles from Sutter's settlement and many times that distance from anything that could be called civilization. But Marshall could see no alternative. The Mormons were as irreplaceable as Jenny Wimmer. They intended to stay only till spring, when they would trek east across the mountains to join their fellow saints on the shores of the Great Salt Lake. John Sutter, Marshall's partner, felt much the same way about Marshall that Marshall felt about Jenny Wimmer. In Sutter's homeland of Switzerland, where tapping the power of falling water was an ancient art, Marshall never would have qualified as a millwright. He had built no mills, nor apprenticed to anyone who had. His training, such as it was in carpentry, which was not irrelevant to the construction of the shed and platform that would house and support the millworks, but lacked the elements of smithing, of fabricating iron gears and levers and steel saw blades, that distinguish the craft of genuine millwrights from the make-do approximations of amateurs. Marshall inspired even less confidence as a business partner, but Sutter needed a sawmill and couldn't build it himself. New Helvetia was thriving a decade after Sutter had persuaded the governor of California to award him a tract of land on the northern frontier of that Mexican province as a way of forestalling settlement by encroaching Americans, whose proximity was already reflected in the name of a principal tributary to the Sacramento, Rio de los Americanos. Sutter selected a site at the confluence of the two streams, on the east bank of the Sacramento and the south bank of the American. The site was 50 river miles from the nearest arm of the San Francisco Bay and 200 miles by river, bay, and ocean from Monterey, the provincial capital. Sutter was a soldier by training, albeit less training than he let on. He said he had reached the rank of captain in the Swiss Army, but he never got further than first under-lieutenant of reserves. The governor of California commissioned Sutter a captain of militia to guard against the Americans and other foreigners. Sutter was also appointed alcalde, thereby receiving powers akin to those of an American mayor and sheriff combined. Sutter knew enough about Americans to know they collectively possessed an annoying self-confidence, a smug certitude that God smiled more brightly on them than on any other portion of humanity. But he had never met anyone as infuriatingly self-assured as John Fremont. Sutter's fitfulness traced to the March day in 1844, when this American military officer unexpectedly appeared from out of the snowdrifts of the Sierras. The American captain had conquered the mountains to reach California, and he acted as if he could conquer anything or anyone in the valley below. On that first visit, Fremont had contented himself with registering disdain for Mexican authority, parading about the province as he pleased, leaving only when he saw fit. He returned in December 1845, and his second coming heralded the war that even now seemed likely to wrest California from Mexico and deliver it to the United States. Whichever country wound up owning California would need the cattle Sutter's pastures fed, the grain his gristmill ground, the lumber his sawmill on the American River cut. In Switzerland, Sutter would have insisted on better than Marshall. But California wasn't Switzerland, as he had to keep reminding himself. The terms of the partnership with Marshall were straightforward. Sutter would furnish materials for construction and expenses and wages for the men. Marshall would supervise construction and manage operation of the mill. The two would split the profits from the sale of the lumber. Marshall was counting on the partnership. For most of his life, it seemed his only partner had been bad luck. His father died when Marshall was in his early 20s, leaving the young man nothing but debts, and with little alternative, as he saw it, to heading west on the tide of the times. He drifted through Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, stumbling into Missouri during the land rush to the Platte Purchase on the Missouri River. In the early 1840s, the Missouri Valley was a highway to Oregon, a land extolled for its fertile soil and salubrious climate. Marshall joined an emigrant train and in the spring of 1845 arrived in the Willamette Valley. But that spring was as drizzly as most Oregon springs, and in early June, having hardly seen the sun, Marshall headed south. With a small party, he crossed the curiously chaotic Siskiyou Mountains, and in mid-July found himself at the gate of Sutter's fort. Sutter, looking over the new arrivals, remarked their decent appearance and allowed, in light of the shortage of even marginally skilled labor in the area, that some might be very useful. He welcomed them on behalf of the Mexican government and issued them visas. He offered Marshall work around the fort, and when the American proved handy with small tools, Sutter helped him arrange a mortgage to purchase 2 leagues of land on a tributary of the Sacramento. Marshall took some of his wages from Sutter in cattle, which he used to stock his new ranch. He had scarcely started ranching when the war broke out between the United States and Mexico. Along with nearly all the Americans in California, Marshall sided with the land of his birth against the country of his current residence. He enlisted under Captain Fremont and marched south to San Pasqual, then to San Diego. After a great deal of walking and relatively little fighting, he was mustered out at San Diego in March 1847. Another long walk brought him back to the Sacramento Valley, where he learned that in his absence his cattle had strayed or been stolen. This was a grievous blow, for the cattle were more valuable than the land. Without the cattle, he couldn't make the payments on his mortgage. He lost the land, and once again turned to Sutter for work. Sutter spoke of a sawmill, for which Marshall began scouting. The two elements, timber and accessibility via wagon, were crucial and not often encountered together. Also, the mill had to be on or very near the river. Marshall and Sutter relied on falling water to drive the blade that would saw the wood, and lacking much money and many men, they had to take the water where they found it. Minor modification of stream flow was feasible, major diversion was not. It was Marshall's job to discover a site that balanced availability of wood and water with accessibility and proximity. He found a likely spot, about 40 miles upstream from the fort, in a valley the local Indians called Coloma. Marshall reported back to Sutter and described Coloma. At the time, he probably intended to rely on Indian labor, although he and Sutter, too, had some reservations. Luckily, not long after Sutter satisfied himself that Marshall's plan was feasible, and the two exchanged signatures on a contract, the labor problem solved itself, temporarily at any rate. The war with Mexico began at just the moment when the Mormons, having been driven sequentially from Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois, were planning their hegira to the wilderness beyond the boundaries of the United States. Precisely where the hegira would end hadn't been established, but Mormon leader Brigham Young and his fellow elders could tell that the trek would be difficult and expensive. Any assistance from almost any source would be appreciated. When the call came from Washington for volunteers against Mexico, Young recognized the possibilities it presented. Uncle Sam was offering to transport west as many men as the Mormons could supply and pay them for the journey. Of course, their time and their lives would not be their own for the duration of the fighting, but at war's end they would be closer to the Mormons' new home, wherever that proved to be, and would have pockets full of cash, which would help build the new colony. So the Mormon Council of 12 issued its own call for volunteers on Washington's behalf, and the Mormon Battalion was born. It was a tough but otherwise healthy crew that left the employ of the U.S. Army in July 18.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?